Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness. It's a historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we're speaking with Joe Marino. He is one of the preeminent researchers on the Shroud of Turin. We'll be talking about some of his recent papers, which can be found on academia.edu. And as a matter of fact, you can find those specifically at independent.academia.edu/Joe Marino, capital J, capital M, all one word. Independent.academia.edu/Joe Marino. And then, of course, if you want to sign up for his email newsletter, it's a wealth of activity that's taking place every day and every week on the Shroud. And that's you can reach out to him at jmarino240@aol.com. So let me tell you a little bit about Joe. He has an amazing background and especially many years of studying the Shroud. He has a BA in theological studies from St. Louis University. He's a longtime Sindonologist, and he has researched, written, and lectured extensively on the Shroud since 1977. And he has recently retired from the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Joe believes the Shroud can be shown to be the burial cloth of Jesus, but that would make it only an interesting archaeological object. He does believe, though, that it's much more important for the spiritual message that it can bring. As a former Benedictine monk and Catholic priest, Joe believes that organized religion has often depicted Jesus as an unreachable deity whose standards we can never reach. With his work, he hopes to show that the Shroud represents a more human Jesus, one who is someone we can not only approach, but, as indicated in the Gospel of John, a person can even surpass in doing great things. It is his hope and desire that his work can get the message across, and it is his belief that this is the destiny to which he has been called, which is why he has been given the passion he possesses for the Shroud. Joe, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Hi, Guy. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you, and good to see you too. So tell us about some of the recent work you've been doing.
Well, let's see. I put out an article the other day on Academia that was having to do with past testing of the Shroud and future proposals. And then I also I constantly update a lot of the articles on Academia. And last year I'd written a rather extensive paper called Documented References to the Shroud of Turin before, what was that? I can always forget my own titles, before 1350 or something like that. And I just added a postscript, which was an unpublished article that I had written a couple years ago, I guess, and that I didn't publish because Jack Marquardt was coming out with a book called The Hidden History of the Shroud, which is a very good book. I highly recommend it. So I held off on that article, but I decided, now that his book has been out for a while, I've decided to add that article to my documented references paper, so that can be found there too. So now that paper is up to about 54 pages or something like that. So you can keep busy with that one, of course, and a lot of the other ones. I always try to put other sources and references in my articles so that it's, I document what I say and I give other sources so people can look up stuff themselves. It's great having the internet. You don't have to go through dusty libraries like I used to do to get all the print materials. And then the other big thing on my radar right now is that I was approached by the Mexican Center of Sindonology, and in May they're going to have their 40th anniversary, and they've asked me to present virtually a presentation. And I'm hoping that they'll let me do an update of my invisible reweave theory paper that I had last presented in Ancaster, Ontario in 2019. And I've gotten some additional information since then. So I have to tidy that up for the possible presentation virtually in May for that. And then I guess the one other thing that I'm doing that's significant is that I'm working with a group with Myra Adams, who you've had on the show. She's trying to start a national Shroud of Turin exhibit. And as many people know, Myra's also been involved with the Museum of the Bible that had that wonderful exhibit, interactive exhibit. And we're in consultation with the Museum of the Bible right now for their collaboration to start the National Shroud of Turin exhibit. So those are some of the things on my plate, and it's never a dull moment in Sindonology. There's always something going on. There's several movies coming out soon, and there's lots of videos always come out, and I list those in my list that I send to people, and that you mentioned that they can email me to get on the list. So I expect 2023 to be an exciting year. And by the way, besides your book, I think I wrote down just the names of people I know that are coming out with a book, and I think I've got 8 on the list now. And those are the ones I know of. I imagine there might be a few more as well.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there's a lot of writing and a lot of good stuff coming out, and the wealth of papers and things like that. And I will admit it's very hard to keep up. I did want to ask as well, maybe you could tell us a little bit about one of your books, the 1988 carbon-14 dating of the Shroud of Turin. Just give a brief update on that and go from there.
Well, let's see. That was published in fall of November 2020, I believe. And I knew that it's 800 pages, by the way, so don't expect to read it in one night. It's more of a reference book than anything. And I knew that more material would come out, and I didn't know if I would do a second edition or not, but I first reserved a page on my website for kind of an overflow and a place to make corrections if needed and that sort of thing. So I did that at first, and then I thought, well, I do so much on academia, I ended up copying and pasting that supplement, and that's one of the entries on my page. It's called Supplement to the 1988 C14 dating of the Shroud of Turin, a stunning expose. So there's about, I think, 80 additional entries on that, and it's as I say, it's a supplement, but it kind of can be read as a standalone. It also goes in chronological order, and if you don't want to read 800 pages, you can kind of read the supplement and get a feel of the weird things that constantly went on both before, during, and after the testing. And it's my contention that there were a lot of politics, egos, and agendas involved, and that finding the truth about the dating of the Shroud was actually a secondary consideration for most of the participants. And yeah, I expect the flow of information for that is kind of slowed down finally, but I expected it to at some point. But I will keep that supplement page open for adding any new tidbits I get.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating. And when I was reading it, I agree with you. What you put in there was incredible about like you said, the politics, the agenda, and all of the other kind of non-scientific, being neutral in the science that went on is astounding. And so when you say the stunning expose, I I think that's a really good subtitle for it. So, and very interesting, definitely worth a read. And I like reading that kind of stuff. So it was very fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah. So today, though, I wanted to talk about, if we could, is one of the challenges that we have with the Shroud is that there's not really a good documented history prior to about 1350. And then there's a big argument as to whether this shroud, it's called the Shroud of Besançon in France, in Troyes, France, and whether that one as potentially being fake, potentially being the shroud. And there's a whole story there and a lot of interesting things going on, and wanted to talk about that. So maybe we can dig into there. You also did a paper on that, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. My title on that was the painted cloth mentioned in the D'Arcy's memorandum of 1389 the so-called Shroud of Besançon? And I've got a picture on the front page of that article, which it's a copy of the whatever was the original Besançon cloth, and the viewer will see how poorly art was, and this was from the 16th century. This particular copy that I have a picture of, it came from a book by Paul Vignon, the French researcher. There's a English translation of his book from, I think it was 1902 when it was originally published, and it came out in 1970. And it's really laughable, this copy. And I make a point in the paper that whatever the original one was, the original Besançon cloth, probably wasn't much better artistically than this one. And apparently it was only the, or at least according to some accounts, it was the front image only and not the front and back. So that should make it easier to determine, where the real one was. But I tell you, I was going over a lot of this material last night and this morning, and it's about as clear as mud. It's very confusing. You got some people, including some historians, believing that the Shroud of Besançon was actually the Shroud of Turin. And you've got other people on the other side, including historians, that believe that there wasn't even a Shroud of Besançon until the 16th century. Now that kind of blows my mind, because some people said, well, there was the Besançon cloth was in a fire in 1349. And then you got other people saying, well, it didn't even exist till the 16th century. So we're talking minimum, 200 years. It's like, come on, historians, can't figure out if at least there was or wasn't a cloth in Besançon in 1349? And some priests have written some accounts, and some historians have criticized that, because I know you also had Mario Latendresse on your show, and he complained about some of the accounts that I have excerpts from. He says the priests are writing a novel and making up stuff in their stories. But Dr. Daniel Scavone, who's a bona fide Shroud historian, and unfortunately he's been in ill health for a while, for many years now, actually. He believes the Besançon cloth is the key to the missing years between 1204 and 1354. 1355, that date will vary a little. You'll see 1354, 55, and 57 is the first documented history of the Shroud. And that's only a 4-year period, so that's not a big deal, I don't think. But Scavone believes the Besançon cloth is the best explanation for where the Shroud was in those missing years. Now, Vignon, in his 1970 book, claimed that an archivist from the Besançon library wrote that the the Shroud of Besançon was given to Othon de la Roche in 1205 as a recompense for his valor at the siege of Constantinople. And then he claims that in the 13th century, there was at Besançon a holy shroud. He says in 1349 it was burnt. And then he says some years after it reappeared or was replaced by another. I mean, that's kind of vague, actually. But and then he says this other cloth, subsequent to 1349 and prior to 1375, was simply a copy of the Shroud of Turin. And then there's a priest named Arthur Barnes, and he had a book in the 30s, I think, and he wrote some articles as well in the 30s. And he wrote a whole article, and I read the excerpt from the article, from what I put in my article last night, and it's very confusing. He talks about copies. He claims Geoffroy de Charny made a copy. Another priest claims that his wife, Jeanne de Vergy, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, de Vergy. Vergy.
No, I think it's Vergy, yeah.
Vergy, thank you. That she made the copy, and so it gets very confusing with these copies. So that's why I asked the question. It's like, well, if there were copies, could one of these actually be what the Bishop Darcy's was claiming was a painting, you know? And you also were, when we were talking before we started about the anti-popes and the popes. Well, it's important to remember that Clement VII was the pope in 1390 when Geoffroy de Charny's son tried to exhibit the shroud, and then he said, you can't say it's the real shroud of Christ, but just a representation. Father Barnes makes the point that when we go further down the road, like in the 1450s, when Margaret de Charny owned the shroud, he said that because the anti-pope reign ended after about, I think it was 1377. After that period, their pronouncements carried much less weight, and by that time, in the 1450s, the popes were in Rome again, and then a lot of the popes in Rome then began to make pronouncements that they believed that the shroud was authentic. So almost any point that you could bring up, you could people on opposite sides of the aisle making points. And so the term lost in the mist of history kind of apply a lot here, because there's just so many versions. And I had mentioned Jack Marquardt before, and his book, The Hidden History of the Shroud of Turin. And his book has an excellent appendix where he goes through 12 different hypotheses of where the shroud was in those missing years, 1204 to about 1355. And what's really nice about it is that he lays out very succinctly all the hypotheses, who gave them, and then he's got a section at the end of each hypothesis saying that the deficiencies that are involved. And he actually has his own hypothesis. He's written a lot of papers and presented at conferences, and he even listed some deficiencies of his own theory or hypotheses, which I thought was kind of cool, because very few people go on record of saying, well, here's my theory, but here's what's weak about it.
Yeah.
To be honest, I was trying to decide where the strongest historical evidence is, and I see bona fide historians, as I said, on both sides of the aisle. And to be totally honest, I don't think I have a favorite theory. I think they all have their strong points and they all have some weak points. And I think we just kind of have to wait for historians to sort it out better, and we can hope, I think, that more historical documents are found that have been undiscovered. And maybe we'll know more in the future. But I always make the point, a lot of historians, obviously for good reason, are big on original documents. But I always make the point to people that historical documents can be forged. In fact, there's a reference in some of these theories that are related to what we're talking about, that the shroud was sent to Athens in 1206. Some people accept that is a historical document, but I've read other historians that said that that's a fake, that the actual letter is a fake. So documents can be forged, documents can be missing, and some things and some historical facts may have never been documented in the first place. So as much as you try to find obviously all the historical documents, but even that has its weak point. And you have to look at it in the context of other disciplines as well. And I'm not sure any one discipline can make or break the shroud. It's really a combination of all the data.
Yeah, and I think you're so right about that. It's the culmination of everything. Even the scientific data, if you take this test and that test, and Ray Rogers with his vanillin in the lignin, and then you have the carbon-14, and then you have this and that. All of those pieces kind of come together to either disprove or prove the authenticity of the shroud. And in the same thing in this case, I was talking to Mario Latendresse, and he basically said more or less the same kind of thing. You need a handful of different historical references, because some of them can be forgeries, some of them can be wrong or written wrong or dated wrong or whatever. There can be all kinds of little things that kind of confuse the
Right.
actual history that took place. And I think as well, when you talk about the shroud, there's no question that over at least the last 500 years, there have been copies made of the shroud, and those copies exist, and they've been they're in different churches or in different possession of whatever, and so there's no reason to think that there weren't copies made. And so when you think about the Besançon, the shroud in Besançon, whether that was a copy or not, or whether it was the real one or replaced by a copy, there's all kinds of, I think there could be all kinds of hypotheses that could help historians and Sindonologists kind of come up with what is maybe the most likely scenario. It's doubtful we'll ever get 100% knowledge of what happened, but at least we'll get maybe one or two that are most likely scenarios of what actually happened.
And by the way, I think before I mistakenly said, when I was talking about the shroud in the 1450s, I think I said Margaret of Austria. It was actually Margaret de Charny still at this point. Margaret of Austria was from the House of Savoy, and she owned the shroud in the late 1400s, early 1500s.
Yeah, no, you did say Marguerite de Charny, and I think she was also, you mentioned a couple of names as well, Jean de Vergy. I think she was a successor of his, and then you have the Geoffrey what's his name is Geoffrey de Charny, and all of those kind of come together. And there's a lot of confusion as to, like you said, did Geoffrey de Charny, did he commission a handful of copies to be made? If it really is the shroud, then people would like to have a copy of it, because there's some
Right.
value in having that copy.
Mhm.
So there could be, a whole bunch of different things that were either documented or not.
And by the way, I also wanted to mention that Bishop Darcy's, he was the bishop around 1389 when Geoffroy de Charny II was trying to exhibit the shroud. The successor to him, who was a man named Bishop Louis, I don't know how you pronounce it, it's Raguier. He claimed that he believed the shroud was authentic. Now, I think he immediately succeeded Darcy. So, when the skeptics say, "Oh, Bishop Darcy said it was a fake," they probably don't even know about his successor, much less mention it. But you have to, you just can't take one little fact and take it out of context. I mean, you got to look at the history at the time, the history that preceded it, and what happened afterwards. It's not as simple as the skeptics make it.
And that's why I agree with you. Jack Marquardt's book, where he looked at the various hypotheses, and then you come up with a hypothesis, and you say, well, here's where it could be right, here's where it could be wrong. I thought that's a very valuable way to look at it,
Mm-hmm.
and it helps, I think, to lead to further study. So hey, I'm pretty certain, or we're all pretty certain about this, but here are a couple of questions where it might be wrong or might need to be slightly improved. And I think that's a great way for Sindonologists, especially on something that's this valuable, to improve the overall history of what we know and the knowledge base of what we have concerning the shroud.
Yeah, and Jack actually mentions in those 12 hypotheses that some of them are kind of combinations of some of the other ones. So it gets even more complicated. So I'm always amazed when I listen to Mario or any historians on podcasts and stuff, and they rattle off these names and dates. I mean, I can remember a few of them here or there, but it's like some of these people, it's like, how do you remember all these historical facts, which we assume are facts, but they may be, maybe not as certain as some of them would like to think. But
yeah, exactly. Well, the only one I know for certain is my wife's birthday. After that, I don't know.
Forgot your own too, huh?
Yeah, that's right. Let's see, was it then or when was that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, well, that was very interesting. So, could you talk a little bit about the what is believed to be the Shroud of Turin, how it was presented and exhibited in Lire, and then maybe a little bit before and after that?
Okay, so Geoffroy de Charny I, although now I just read recently where it's questioned whether the Geoffroy de Charny in 1389 was actually the son of Geoffroy de Charny I. Nothing is sacred. Yeah, that's even being questioned. I think most researchers assume that the Geoffroy de Charny II was the actual son of the Geoffroy de Charny from 1355 or 1354. So he tried to, or he did exhibit the shroud around 1354, and the bishop at that time was Bishop Henri de Poitiers. Okay, and then the hubbub began in 1389 when de Poitiers' successor Darcy's tried to prevent the second Geoffroy from also exhibiting the shroud, and Darcy's claimed that the predecessor Henri had found the actual artist that had made the shroud, and that isn't straightforward as it sounds either, because Darcy was trying to raise money for his cathedral. I think there was a fire or something in the cathedral, and he was trying to rebuild it.
Yep.
So
and the choir and a lot of the roof and a lot of damages were there.
So the Geoffroy II went over Darcy's head and got permission from the anti-pope Clement VII to exhibit the shroud, and So there might have been an ulterior motive there. It's like he was going to lose any contributions related to a possible exhibition of the shroud. So it may not have been just, a pure motive of saying the shroud's a fake, um, and it shouldn't be done. But Henri, in 1356 had written a glowing piece about Geoffrey de Charnay, who was killed the next year in 1357. And when he did the report, he didn't say anything negative about Geoffrey. So if Darcy's was correct, and that he claimed that Geoffrey I was trying to exhibit a fake, you would have thought that Henry would have mentioned something in his glowing report of 1356, but he didn't. So that's that's another thing you got to look at and ask some questions, and it can get complicated with the multi layers of things going on. So the shroud was exhibited at Loret around 1354, and then like I say, the first historical really written document comes out with the Darcy's memorandum of, we always say circa 1389, because his memo is undated. It was never sent to the Pope, to the anti-Pope, and there's a reference to Bishop Henri within the text of the document saying about 34 years previously, which puts it in that 1355 range. So for a while it was known as the Shroud of Loret, and then eventually it stayed for a while in Chambéry, France, where it was in the fire in 1532, and then it was brought to Turin in 1578. And at that point became known as the Shroud of Turin, and it's been there ever since, except for a short period during World War II when it was moved to a Benedictine monastery to save it from the Nazis. Hitler was trying to get his hands on it.
Yeah. No, and that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for that. Now, the other thing that's also kind of interesting is, now you mentioned Othon de la Roche and the potential path that the shroud may have taken through Athens in 1205, 1206, and then potentially later. So Othon de la Roche, his home was actually in Rigny, I think it's Rigny, France, which is not too far from Lirey. And, so it could be that it went that way. One of the other hypotheses is that it was purchased by, I think it was King Louis, from, I think it's Boniface, the king of Constantinople at the time. And then it went that way to Paris, and then it went over to Lirey as a gift to Geoffrey de Charnay I.
Yeah, one of the articles I was reviewing is by Ian Wilson, which most people will be familiar with as one of the prominent shroud historians, and he presented a paper in I think it was Valencia, Spain in 2012, called "Discovering More of the Shroud's Early History," and that can be found. Barry's wonderful site, shroud.com, has some of the papers there, and it should be there. But I noticed he mentioned a name that wasn't on my radar at all. And he says, I'm going to read it from the paper. He says, accordingly, I believe it to be a possibility worthy of at least some serious consideration that the original first Frenchman to whom the shroud was entrusted may have been not Geoffrey de Charnay, but instead the higher born Edward de Beaujeu, and that is spelled Beaujaue. So I just throw that out there for any historians that might want to dig further into that. But Edward de Beaujeu, Beaujaue. So that's a new name that
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was previously unaware of till Wilson brought it up.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that name, and very interesting. Now, does it say where he's from?
Um, let's see. It says he fought with Joffrey during the Smyrna campaign. I don't know where he was born. I don't think it says that. But they fought together in
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things too is, as I was talking with Mario Latendresse, was he said there's still surprisingly a lot of documents that have not yet been,
Mm,
I don't know, cataloged, read, or
mm,
digitized or whatever, so that
mm,
they can be made available more generally. So, maybe is an interesting research path that could turn up some
right.
new lines
Mm,
of another hypothesis on how the
mhm.
shroud got from from Constantinople, then up to Ray, and then up over to Turin.
Yeah, Mario actually favors what's called the Sainte-Chapelle
Yeah.
hypothesis. Um, so he thinks that that the Mendelian was the shroud, and when he thinks it was seeded from King Louis IX by Baldwin, um, and he thinks it was kept in an original Byzantine reliquary for about a century. He's also Mario reads French. He's got the French heritage, and so he can read those documents in French. And he studied the record relics, the inventory,
Mm.
and he claims that the last inventory taken before the French Revolution indicates that the Mendelian cloth was no longer in the reliquary, and so he believes the Mendelian was actually the shroud. That's also obviously debated by a lot of people as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And when you talk about that, the Mendelian was believed to be a cloth image in Edessa, which is modern day eastern Turkey in Sanliurfa. And it's interesting. There's a couple of different theories then as how it got from Edessa to Constantinople. One line of research I would love to do is there seems to be, a little bit more proof, a lot more proof that the emperor at the time in Constantinople sent an army over to Edessa to pick up the shroud and buy it from the Muslims and then bring it back. And one thing would be interesting is if that was the case, and if he paid a king's ransom for it, which is, tons of silver or hundreds of pounds of silver and gold, then you would think there would also be some kind of a receipt or history on the other side.
Yeah.
That the Muslims would have also said, "Hey, we just received this, and it just went into the treasury, or it went somewhere." And so there would be a receipt for all of that gold and silver that might have come up. And so that would be another interesting way to prove that, yes, this is how the shroud got from Edessa over to Constantinople, and then there's proof on the other side that, yes, there was money traded for it.
Yeah, if the viewer can find online, and I know I have it in one of, in fact, my documented history or documented references, the new article that I added. If they look up a couple of the articles by Pam Moon in the basically the references section of that postscript, there's a rendition of the cloth coming to Constantinople in 944 or 945.
Yeah, no, I think it's 944.
944. Yeah, and you could see a person presenting to the emperor what appears to be a very long cloth, and there's sort of like a disembodied head on top of the cloth. I mean, it obviously isn't clear to reality in terms of what it's trying to depict. You could tell there's some artistic license being used here. And the only thing that to me that really makes sense is that they're trying to depict a long cloth with an image on it that includes a head. And I think that's one of the strong points to show that a long cloth with an image came to Constantinople in 944. And, as Russ Braille often likes to point out, after it was sacked, after the shroud was sacked in 1204, it's easy to make a link between that cloth and what arrived in 944. So, then you start seeing how the carbon date is off by not only 70 years, if you take the 1204 or whatever, but you have to add another 300 years to go back to the 944. So I think there's a strong case, I believe, and Dan Scavone has written many detailed articles about the evidence for the shroud being in Constantinople in 944. And so I think you got the image of Edessa around the 6th century, and then it's taken to Constantinople and becomes known as the Mandylion. Many people think the Mandylion is the shroud. We have the missing gap between 1204 and 1354, and that can be plausibly, explained depending on your hypothesis. Obviously, it's not as solid as we'd like to be, but once you put in those gaps, you do have a pretty solid history, at least from the 6th century, and then you got some prehistory before the 6th century that's pretty strong. I've got references in my documented references paper that from the 2nd, even through the 2nd through the 5th centuries, where there's references, not necessarily to the shroud with an image on it, but there's references to burial linens and that could be the Shroud of Turin. So while the history is not as strong as you'd like it to be, you can certainly make a plausible case for the shroud going back all the way to the 1st century.
Yeah. And I think, even in Paul in chapter 3, there's potentially a indirect, direct kind of reference to some kind of an image. You have seen the image. And so there's potentially references in the Bible that after the tomb and the linens being discovered in the tomb. And then to your point as well, there's also indirect images that are there's a Syrian Pantocrator image, I think from the 500s. There's the in the Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople there, which was built in the 500s, 600s. There's an image in there that references or looks like the image from the shroud. There's all kinds of coins, and so there are many indirect images that really look like they are pre 1260 to 1390 of the carbon dating.
Right. Yeah, I'd also recommend. There's a researcher named Larry Stalley, Stalley, and he has some really good papers that touch on those sorts of matters, and they're very erudite. He knows Greek well, and he's got tons of footnotes. And searching on academia is not as precise as I'd like it to be. And by the way, if you go to my page and try to do a word search on on a particular word for a title, good luck with that. Sometimes it'll find it, and then 2 minutes later it won't. That happened to me last night. I was searching on it. Kind of drives me nuts, but yeah. Anyway, Larry has some very good papers. Papers like is the sign of Jonah related to the shroud? Was Jesus talking about the shroud there? And he talks about the Galatians 3:1. You who before your very eyes he was crucified. There seems to be a reference to an image that he's referring to. Larry does a whole paper on that, I think, and I also recommend a lot of his papers.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
the
He
reader.
has a lot of good non-canonical books that he can reference from, the early couple of centuries there that were written that have different references. And I think of the Signs of Jonah is one of them.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's tons of good material out there to read. You could, it's really almost like a full-time job just trying
Yeah.
to keep up with all the materials that come out. And I'm glad I'm retired.
Yeah, well,
So,
I wish I were retired so I could
mm,
spend more time on it.
mm,
I find it so fascinating,
mm,
and I've got a whole list of things that I
mm,
want to read, and
mm.
unfortunately I just can't get to it.
Yeah.
But so now, just one last question. You mentioned the gaps in the early history. You said you wrote a paper on that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it. The paper is titled "Gaps in the Early History of the Shroud of Turin. Do they disauthenticate it?"
Right. So that will not be listed as a separate article. I had intended to list that on academia as a separate article. And as I said, I kind of held it back. But after Jack's book was published, I decided to just add it to my documented references paper because it fit in pretty well. And so that's a postscript on my paper. And one of the points I wanted to make with that is, skeptics and maybe even some Christians will say, "Oh, come on! If the shroud really existed, don't you think the historical record would be stronger?" And that's kind of a natural reaction. I think you would think something that valuable, you would be able to, people that had it would keep records and stuff. But as we said, sometimes history is not written down like we would have liked it to have been. And one of my main points in this article / postscript is that I was amazed. I did a Google search on missing valuable historical objects, and you'd be amazed at how many important objects in history have been lost. Some of them have been recovered and some haven't. So, the shroud is really no different. It's been through fires and wars and looting and, family dynasties and, with all the concomitant politics and things going on. I'd almost be suspicious if somebody said we did have a solid history for every second, of the shroud from whatever date you might pick. So, history is so fascinating because always has so many twists and turns, and of course the shroud does as well. But that article has basically in the references section a lot of good articles, a lot of them that are online, and a couple videos, good videos as well, YouTube videos. Russ Brill does a nice video called "The Shroud of Turin: Art, Icon, or Relic." People may want to take a look at that. But one thing that really kind of gets under my skin is so many people that dispute the shroud, do little or no homework, and they just kind of it's easy to make your voice heard on the internet because all you have to do is do a podcast or make a comment on a video or something. And I had an interesting one the other day. A guy claimed on Father Dalton's recent video, which is just absolutely phenomenal. It's over 3 hours. I recommend everybody listen to that. And this one guy posted something about adult fantasies and this and that and the other. And I posted a comment to him. I said, well, if this is so silly to you, why are you even bother listening to it? And he wrote a comment back saying something like, arguing from ignorance is not a strong position. And I said, how is that asking a question? arguing
funny.
from ignorance. And I says, and by the way, I'm not ignorant. I've written a couple books, dozens of articles, and I've spent countless thousands of hours over 45 years. How much time have you spent studying the Shroud? And surprisingly, I did not get a reply from him. So
I don't know why not. I think the other thing too that's interesting, and sorry, that is funny. And and even on my podcasts, I get a lot of those comments as well. But going back to the gaps, you do have people that want to either steal it or destroy it. So you have, let's say, Hitler that wanted to steal it and take it back to to Nazi Germany. You have early on even the Romans and potentially even the Sanhedrin that would have wanted to destroy it. And so it had to be hidden, and it had to be very carefully guarded, and not that many people could see it. And then you have other kind of politics. You've got the iconoclasm in Constantinople, where the exhibition of the shroud and even potentially the coins of having an image of Jesus on it was thought to have brought on earthquakes and what have you. And so then they had to hide it after that. So there are all kinds of reasons as to why there would be or could be gaps that are very easily explainable based on the the events of the day.
Right, absolutely. Both the Romans and the Jews would have loved to destroy the shroud right off the bat. So it's not surprising that they would have hid it. And maybe, who knows, maybe they didn't even mention the image in the Gospels because they didn't want to draw extra attention to it.
Yep, exactly. So, fascinating. And thank you for bringing that up. And I think you're right. I think hopefully at some point, as the research continues and the various papers get researched and digitized and brought to light, that we can all see that hopefully more of these gaps will be narrowed and narrowed and narrowed.
Right.
Before we close, anything else you'd like to mention?
I think most people are aware of it, but if you're not, make sure you visit Barry Schwartz's site, www.shroud.com. Barry was the documenting photographer for the 1978 STURP team. It's the best shroud site on the planet. You can spend the rest of your life there if you're not careful, but do check that out. Some great materials there. And I would, again, just my pet peeve, if you're gonna do some shroud research of any kind, make sure you put in the time that's needed. I'm not saying everybody has to spend most of their time on it like I do or anything, but I would love to hear more people say, when they give their opinion about the shroud, it's something to the effect that, well, I haven't studied it a lot. I'm going to defer to the experts, or I'll have to do more reading. No, most people just give their opinion and expect you to accept their view without any solid evidence that they're presenting about it.
Yeah, and without any solid research backing it up.
Right.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Joe, thank you so much. It's always fascinating to talk with you, and I really appreciate the time that you took today, and look forward to all of the research as you bring it forward. Again, just to remind folks, if you'd like to sign up for Joe's email newsletter, that's at jmarino240@aol.com, jmarino240@aol.com, and otherwise his papers are on academia.edu, and you can find them at independent.academia.edu/Joe Marino, and capital J, capital M, and all one word. So independent.academia.edu/Joe Marino. And with that, please stay tuned for many other videos in this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. Please visit GuyPowell.com and sign up for more episodes. And if you'd like this one, please rate it with 5 stars. Thank you so much. And thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Guy. Appreciate you having me. Good to see you.
Absolutely.